Hi everyone, so in this video we are going to discuss schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is one of the most serious psychological disorders, and it's mistakenly described as someone having a split personality, and that's not at all the case. Schizophrenia is defined as a psychological disorder in which the ability to function is impaired by severely distorted beliefs, perceptions, and thought processes. People who are having what they call a schizophrenic episode, they lose their grip on reality. So now the symptoms of schizophrenia fall into two different categories. They are either positive symptoms or negative symptoms. Positive reflect an excess or distortion of normal functioning, whereas the negative symptoms show the absence of some normal things of functioning. So we'll start by talking about these positive symptoms. So the first of these is delusions. And a delusion is a false belief that persists despite compelling contradictory evidence. So for example, they know there's proof that something is not true, but they still hold on to that belief. They're usually bizarre, far-fetched notions, and the delusional person usually gets preoccupied with all these beliefs. And again, this person ignores everything that contradicts those beliefs. Now, there are certain themes that are consistent in schizophrenic delusions. The first one is delusions of reference, and they reflect a person's false convictions that other people's behavior and ordinary events are somehow personally related to him or her. This could be anything from seeing a billboard and saying, oh, that's a message to me and it's an encrypted message and I have to decode it, to believing that Facebook posts are about them, etc. Delusions of grandeur involve the belief that the person is extremely powerful, important, or wealthy. The person may think that one delusion that I've actually heard, a delusion of grandeur I've heard, person believed that she was actually the Queen of England. Delusions of persecution, they involve the belief that others are plotting against him or her and trying to harm that person or someone close to him or her. And then there's the delusion of being controlled. And it involves the belief that outside forces like aliens, the government, whoever it is, might be trying to exert some sort of control on the individual. So David Berkowitz is actually a great example of this. He's a serial killer from the 1970s, and he was known as the Son of Sam. He believed his neighbor's dog was telling him to go kill people. So delusional thinking can lead to dangerous behaviors. That person could cause harm to himself or herself, or could even attack others, like in the case of David Berkowitz. So the next positive symptom we have are hallucinations. So hallucinations are false or distorted perceptions, usually voices or visual stimuli, that seem vividly real. So the person who is having the hallucination thoroughly believes that whatever that is actual, it is real. Now, the content of these hallucinations is often tied to the person's delusional beliefs. So, for example, if someone is having a delusion of grandeur, they might have hallucinations that back that all up, that back it up, and maybe it's, they're getting commands from God or the devil or from angels, or maybe they are God, the devil, or the angels. Hallucinations can be virtually impossible to distinguish from objective reality. Now, when the symptoms are less severe, the person might actually recognize that the hallucination is a product of his or her own mind. But during the actual event itself, they may have no clue and not be able to distinguish fact from hallucination. The last one we're going to talk about is severely disorganized thinking. So it becomes really difficult to concentrate and remember and integrate important information while ignoring things that are irrelevant. And the disorganized thinking is often reflected in how that person speaks. Ideas, words, and images are sometimes strung together in ways that seem nonsensical to the listener. So now we'll talk a little bit about negative symptoms. So these consist of marked deficits or decreases in behavior or emotional function. So it could be things like a flat affect. A flat affect, sometimes it's just called diminished emotional expression. This is a common thing that can happen. Emotional responsiveness and facial expressions are reduced. So, they could be happy and not show a smile. They could be angry and not show an angry face, sad and not frowning. Another thing that you may see that would fall into this category would be slowed speech or monotone speech. Negative symptoms can also include the inability to initiate or persist in even the simplest forms of goal-directed behaviors. This could be things like taking a bath or engaging in a social activity. The person might also seem to be completely apathetic. They might sit still for hours at a time and not do anything. The negative symptoms accentuate the isolation of the person with schizophrenia because the person may appear uncommunicative and may seem completely disconnected from his or her environment. Now, it's important to note that not everyone with schizophrenia experiences negative symptoms. So we're going to talk a little bit about the diagnosis of schizophrenia. According to the DSM-5, schizophrenia is diagnosed when 2 or more of these characteristic symptoms are actively present for 1 month or longer. At least one symptom must be either delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. Usually, schizophrenia also involves a longer personal history of 6 months or more of odd behaviors, beliefs, perceptual experiences, and other less severe signs of mental disturbance. Now, schizophrenia may occur with or without catatonia. You might have heard it be called a catatonic state. So catatonia may include symptoms that reflect highly disturbed movements or actions like bizarre posture, grimaces, or it could be something like complete immobility with no speech or very little speech, or extremely agitated behavior. So when we talk about the symptoms, it's important to know that the symptoms actually vary across different cultures. Researchers have found that people in the United States are more likely to experience auditory hallucinations that are dark and sometimes vicious. David Berkowitz is an example again. People in Guyana and India were actually more likely to report having a positive relationship with their voices. There was also a cultural difference in delusions. In Nigeria and Guyana, there were relatively high rates of delusions that involved being an angel or a prophet, concepts that are integral parts of their culture. In studying the delusions of the United States, it was discovered that delusions change over time. During World War II, people would have delusions regarding Nazis, and more recently, delusions have begun to involve technology and the media. Now, when we talk about the prevalence in the course of schizophrenia, every year 200,000 new cases of schizophrenia are diagnosed in the US. Annually, 1 million Americans are treated for schizophrenia. Onset takes place typically in young adulthood, and about a quarter of those who are diagnosed who have a schizophrenic episode never have it come back. They completely recover and they never have another episode. Another quarter will experience follow-up episodes, but they have minimal impairment. The remaining half, for them, schizophrenia becomes a chronic mental illness. It impairs their ability to function. They may end up having repeated hospitalizations, extended treatment stays. They end up becoming an emotional, financial, and psychological burden on their family and society. Now, important to note, a diagnosis of schizophrenia does not mean that person can't be successful in his or her career or personal life. One thing that has been noticed is that cultural factors seem to affect the outcome. So despite less access to mental health care, people with schizophrenia often have a better outcome in the developing world than in the developed world. The World Health Organization found that full recovery after a single episode of psychosis occurred in just 3% of the cases in the United States, but in 54% of the cases in India. This suggests that people in the developing world might be more accepting of mental illness and are more likely to have extended family and support systems than people who are in the developed world. For people with schizophrenia living in the developed world, the decline in symptoms did not coincide with improved life functioning. Now, if we talk about what causes schizophrenia, it's important to note this is really a complex disorder, and there's an enormous individual variability in the onset, the symptoms, the duration, and even the recovery from schizophrenia. Now, when we talk about the causes, there's quite a list. There are genetic factors. Through family, twin, and adoption studies, they've firmly established that there are genetic factors that play a significant role. Schizophrenia tends to cluster in families. Family and twin studies have also consistently shown that the more closely related a person is to someone who has schizophrenia, the greater risk that he or she will be diagnosed with schizophrenia at some point in her lifetime exists. Adoption studies have also consistently shown that if either biological parent of an adopted individual had schizophrenia, the adopted individual is at a greater risk to develop schizophrenia. By studying families that display a high rate of schizophrenia, researchers have consistently found that the presence of certain genetic variations seem to increase susceptibility to the disorder. Now remember, it's susceptibility to the disorder. It's not a guarantee. It's a genetic predisposition. Now, some of the best evidence that points to the genetic involvement of schizophrenia actually also contradicts it. So they've determined there's a 50% risk rate for a person whose identical twin has schizophrenia. But if you look at that, if they're identical twins, you would expect it to be much closer to 100%, as they're monozygotic twins and they shared all of the same DNA. So obviously non-genetic factors also have to play a role, because otherwise why would there be one schizophrenic twin and one who did not develop schizophrenia? So scientists are getting closer to identifying some of the specific genetic patterns, but they have not discovered what genes are involved just yet. There's also the immune system. So researchers have theorized that exposure to the influenza virus or other viral infections during prenatal development or shortly after birth could lead to schizophrenia. Now, according to this theory, because viruses can spread to the brain and spinal cord by traveling along the nerves, it is possible for a mother to have been exposed to a virus that has then caused the genetic mutations that then cause the person to develop schizophrenia. So in one study, 64 stored blood samples of mothers of people who later developed schizophrenia were compared with a matched set of blood samples from women whose children did not develop schizophrenia. They were all collected years earlier during the women's pregnancies. After analyzing the blood samples, it was discovered that women who had been exposed to the flu virus during their first trimester had a 7-fold increase in the risk of bearing a child who later developed schizophrenia. There's also abnormal brain structures. They've discovered that about half the people with schizophrenia show abnormalities in their brain structure or function. Sometimes it might be an enlargement of the fluid-filled cavities called ventricles. There's also a loss of gray matter tissue, lower overall brain volume as well. And they've also noticed lower levels of connectivity between the regions of the temporal lobes. Those are responsible for learning and memory. This pattern of decreased connectivity may account for the memory problems often experienced by those with schizophrenia. Now, this doesn't prove that brain abnormalities are the sole cause of schizophrenia, because we don't know which came first, the brain abnormalities or the schizophrenia. When it comes to abnormal brain chemistry, the dopamine hypothesis attributes schizophrenia to excessive activity of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. Now, for some, antipsychotic drugs like Haldol and Thorazine can reduce or block dopamine activity and reduce schizophrenic symptoms. That, however, does not work for everyone. It's also been shown that drugs that enhance dopamine activity, like amphetamines or cocaine, can actually produce schizophrenia-like symptoms in those who do not have schizophrenia. Now, again, there's evidence that contradicts all of this because not everyone is treatable with antipsychotics. And so, again, it's just one of the other theories that is available. Psychological factors, again, there's no single psychological factor, but it seems like those who are genetically predispositioned to develop schizophrenia may be more vulnerable to the effects of disturbed family environments. In a Finnish adoption survey, they discovered that in their group of 180 adopted individuals whose biological mothers did not have schizophrenia, and the 150 adopted individuals whose biological mothers had schizophrenia, the children whose biological mothers had schizophrenia had a much higher rate of schizophrenia than did the control group. However, this was only true when the children were raised in an adoptive home that included psychologically disturbed members. If they were raised in a home where this did not occur, they were no more likely than children of the control group to develop schizophrenia. Bottom line is they still don't know exactly what causes schizophrenia, but they have lots of evidence that shows there are a combination of factors. So our closing thought for this chapter, we're only beginning to understand a lot of these psychological disorders, and we're working on discovering what causes them and how they can all be treated.